The winter wind howled across the flat expanses of East Anglia, carrying with it the bite of a cold that seemed determined to freeze everything in its path. It was December 1943, and the airfields of the United States Army 8th Air Force, scattered across the English countryside, had become battlegrounds of a different kind. Here, in the pre-dawn darkness, a war was being waged not against enemy fighters or flak batteries, but against the most relentless opponent of all, winter itself. At RAF Thorpe Abbotts, home to the 100th Bombardment Group, the mercury had plummeted to levels that would have been considered brutal, even by New England standards. Ground crews shuffled through the darkness, their breath forming clouds of white vapor that hung in the still air like ghosts. Beneath the wings of 30 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, men worked with hands so cold that even the thickest gloves seemed to offer no protection. They were racing against time, against the weather, and against an enemy that had proven more stubborn than anyone had anticipated. The aircraft themselves seemed to feel the cold. Ice crystals formed intricate patterns across the plexiglass windows of the bombardier positions. Frost clung to the aluminum skin of the fuselages, transforming these instruments of war into sculptures of silver and white. But the real problem lay hidden beneath the cowlings of their Wright Cyclone engines, where oil had thickened to the consistency of molasses, and in some cases had solidified completely. This was not the war that anyone had imagined when the 8th Air Force had arrived in England in the spring of 1942. The strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany had been conceived in sunlit briefing rooms, with clean maps and confident predictions. No one had adequately prepared for what it would mean to keep a fleet of 4-engine heavy bombers operational through a European winter that seemed determined to ground every aircraft the Americans possessed. Technical Sergeant Michael Dalton of the 349th Squadron Ground Crew stood before the No. 3 engine of a B-17 dubbed Memphis Belle Jr., and felt a familiar sense of desperation washing over him. 26 years old, from a small town in Ohio where he had worked as an automotive mechanic before the war, Dalton had thought he understood engines. He had rebuilt tractors, repaired trucks, and kept the town's vehicles running through Ohio winters that could be unforgiving. But this was something entirely different. The problem was deceptively simple, yet seemingly insurmountable. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines that powered the B-17 required oil to lubricate their complex arrangement of cylinders, pistons, and valves. In normal conditions, the oil flowed smoothly, maintaining the delicate balance that kept these powerful engines running reliably at altitudes of up to 30,000 feet. But these were not normal conditions. When temperatures dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the SAE 50 weight oil used in the engines began to thicken dramatically. Below 10 degrees, it became so viscous that it could no longer flow properly through the engine's intricate oil passages. And on particularly brutal nights, when the thermometer plunged into single digits or below zero, the oil could become almost solid, turning the engines into assemblages of frozen metal that simply could not be started. The consequences of this simple fact of physics were staggering. Operations orders would arrive from High Wycombe, the headquarters of the 8th Air Force, calling for maximum effort missions against vital targets deep in Germany, Berlin, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, names that had become synonymous with both strategic importance and terrible cost. The bomber groups would assemble their crews, brief the missions, and prepare to launch hundreds of aircraft. And then, in the pre-dawn cold, the ground crews would discover that half or more of their bombers could not be started. The official solution, as outlined in the technical manuals, was to preheat the engines using Herman Nelson heaters, large portable units that blew hot air directly into the engine compartments. But there were never enough heaters to go around. A typical heavy bombardment group had 48 aircraft assigned, but might have access to only a dozen heaters. Even with the heaters, the process was agonizingly slow. It could take 2 hours or more to warm an engine sufficiently to allow it to start, and by that time, mission schedules were in tatters, and the carefully choreographed ballet of a maximum effort, bombing mission had descended into chaos. Worse still, the winter of 1943-44 was proving to be one of the coldest on record. Night after night, temperatures plunged well below freezing. Fog blanketed the airfields, mixing with the industrial haze to create a thick, choking mist that reduced visibility to mere yards. Ice formed on runways, turning takeoffs and landings into exercises in controlled catastrophe. And through it all, the oil continued to freeze, the engines continued to refuse to start, and the strategic bombing campaign that was supposed to bring Nazi Germany to its knees threatened to grind to a halt, not because of enemy action, but because of the simple, immutable laws of chemistry and physics. Sergeant Dalton had seen good men break under the strain, ground crew chiefs who took pride in their work, who had brought their aircraft home through flak and fighter attacks, were now helpless before engines that simply would not turn over. He had watched as his crew chief, Master Sergeant Robert Hammond, a man who never showed emotion, had struck the cowling of an engine with his bare fist in frustration after the third failed starting attempt of a single morning. But it was during a conversation in the mess hall on a particularly brutal night in mid-December that Dalton heard something that would change everything. A group of mechanics from different squadrons had gathered, sharing their misery and swapping stories of the various methods they had tried to combat the cold weather starting problem. One sergeant mentioned that, back home in Montana, bush pilots sometimes added a bit of gasoline to their engine oil to thin it out for winter starting. The comment was met with skepticism, adding gasoline to engine oil. That sounded like a recipe for disaster. Gasoline in the oil system could cause excessive wear, could lead to lubrication failure, could damage seals and gaskets. The more experienced mechanics in the group dismissed it outright. It was the kind of backwoods improvisation that might work for a single-engine crop duster, but would never be acceptable for the precision-engineered Wright Cyclone engines that powered the Flying Fortresses. Dalton said nothing at the time, but the idea lodged itself in his mind like a burr. That night, unable to sleep in the cold Nissen hut that served as quarters for the ground crews, he thought about it. The next day, he found himself in the base technical library, a small room attached to the maintenance hangar, poring over engine manuals and lubrication specifications. What he found was interesting. The viscosity index of SAE-50 oil showed a dramatic increase as temperatures dropped. At 70 degrees Fahrenheit, the oil flowed easily. At 32 degrees, it was noticeably thicker. At 0 degrees, it was like cold honey. But gasoline, even at sub-zero temperatures, remained thin and fluid. If you mix the two together, the gasoline would act as a solvent, thinning the oil and reducing its viscosity. But there were problems. Gasoline was volatile. It would evaporate quickly once the engine warmed up, and gasoline in the oil meant potential fire hazards, meant possible damage to engine components, meant a whole list of complications that the engine manufacturers had never tested for or approved. It was, by any official standard, a completely foolish idea, a stupid idea, the kind of field expedient modification that could get a man court-martialed if something went wrong. And yet, as Dalton stared at the specifications and calculated viscosity ratios in the margins of a notebook, he began to believe it might actually work. The opportunity came 3 nights later. A mission had been scheduled for the following morning, a major strike against an aircraft assembly plant near Brunswick. The mission was critical. Intelligence indicated that the Germans were ramping up production of new jet fighters, and disrupting that production was a top priority. Every available bomber needed to be in the air. But the temperature that night dropped to -2 degrees Fahrenheit. By 3 in the morning, when the ground crews began their pre-flight preparations, it was clear that they had a disaster on their hands. Engine after engine refused to start. The Herman Nelson heaters were distributed, but there simply were not enough, and time was running out. The mission was in jeopardy. Dalton made his decision. He found his crew chief, Sergeant Hammond, and explained his idea. Hammond listened, his face unreadable in the dim light of the work lamps. When Dalton finished, there was a long silence. "You know this could destroy the engines," Hammond finally said. "You know if we do this and it goes wrong, they'll have both our heads." "I know, Sarge," Dalton replied, "but we're going to abort this mission anyway if we can't get these birds started. And we've got 23 aircraft that are stone-cold dead right now. What do we have to lose?" Hammond thought about it. He thought about the crews who were even now suiting up, who were counting on these aircraft to get them to the target and back. He thought about the mission, about the importance of striking the enemy's war-making capacity, and he thought about the regulations he was about to violate. "How much gasoline?" he asked. "I figure about 1 quart of avgas to every 4 quarts of oil," Dalton said. "Enough to thin it, not enough to compromise lubrication once it evaporates." "And you're sure it'll evaporate?" "Once the engine heats up, it should boil off within minutes. The flash point of gasoline is way lower than the operating temperature of these engines." Hammond made his decision. "All right. We'll try it on 2 aircraft. If it works, we spread the word. If it doesn't—" He didn't finish the sentence. They selected 2 B-17s that had been impossible to start, despite extended heating. Working quickly, they drained a portion of the oil from each engine and replaced it with measured amounts of aviation gasoline. They mixed it carefully, using the dipsticks to check the consistency. The mixture was noticeably thinner, flowing more freely in the cold. The moment of truth came when they thought attempted to start the first engine. The crew chief climbed into the cockpit, checked the magneto switches, primed the engine, and engaged the starter. The electric motor whined, turning the propeller slowly. Once, twice, 3 times. And then, incredibly, the engine caught. It coughed, sputtered, sent a gout of white smoke from the exhaust stacks, and then settled into a rough but steady idle. Within 2 minutes, as the engine warmed, the idle smoothed out. Within 5 minutes, it was running as if nothing had ever been wrong. They moved to the second aircraft. Same procedure, same result. The engine started on the 4th blade. Dalton and Hammond looked at each other in the flickering light of the work lamps. They had done something that violated every technical manual, every maintenance procedure, every piece of official guidance they had ever received. And it had worked. Word spread through the ground crews like wildfire. Within 15 minutes, crews from every hard stand on the base were draining oil and adding gasoline. The proportions varied. Some crews used more gasoline, some used less, but the basic principle remained the same. Thin the oil enough to flow in the cold, rely on evaporation to restore normal lubrication once the engines warmed up. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, 21 of the 23 previously unstarted aircraft had roared to life. The mission was on. The B-17s taxied out, formed up, and climbed into the gray winter sky, bound for Germany. Dalton and Hammond waited tensely through the morning, listening to the radio traffic, waiting for any indication that their improvised solution had failed. There were the normal reports, the normal problems, but nothing about engines failing due to oil system problems. By early afternoon, the bombers began returning. They came back damaged by flak, battered by fighters, but none came back because of engine failures caused by oil contamination. The group commander, Colonel Harold Vance, heard about what had been done. He summoned Dalton and Hammond to his office. The 2 sergeants stood at attention, expecting the worst: unauthorized modifications to aircraft systems, potential endangerment of flight crews, violation of technical orders. The list of possible charges was long, but Vance surprised them. "Tell me exactly what you did," he said. They explained the procedure, the ratios, the theory behind it. Vance listened, asking sharp questions, probing for details. When they finished, he was silent for a moment. "You realize," he finally said, "that what you did could have been disastrous. If those engines had failed at the wrong moment, if the gasoline had caused a fire, if any number of things had gone wrong, we could have lost aircraft and crews." "Yes, sir," Hammond replied. "We understand that." "And yet," Vance continued, "we got 21 aircraft into the air that would otherwise have been grounded. 21 aircraft that dropped their bombs on target, that degraded the enemy's war-making capacity, that brought their crews home safely." He paused. "Gentlemen, I'm not going to court-martial you. I'm going to recommend you both for commendations. And I'm going to make sure that every ground crew chief in this group knows exactly what you did and how you did it." The practice spread. Not officially at first. It remained a field expedient, something that ground crews did, but that no one talked about openly. But as word passed from base to base, from one bomb group to another, more and more ground crews began adopting the technique. They refined it, developed standard mixtures, worked out the best procedures. Some called it pre-dilution. Others referred to it as winter starting mixture. The flight crews, who knew only that their aircraft now started reliably even in the coldest weather, called it a miracle. But it was not without risk. There were close calls. A crew at RAF Bassingbourn used too much gasoline in the mixture, and one of their engines ran dangerously hot for the first few minutes after starting, sending alarms through the cockpit and nearly causing an abort. A mechanic at RAF Polbrook forgot to note that he had diluted the oil, and when another mechanic checked the oil level before a second mission, he found it thin and assumed there was contamination, leading to an engine change that proved to be unnecessary. And there was resistance. Some maintenance officers refused to allow the practice, insisting on adherence to technical manuals regardless of the consequences. Some crews continued to struggle with cold weather starts because their leadership would not permit unauthorized modifications. The practice existed in a kind of twilight zone, neither officially approved nor explicitly forbidden, acknowledged by everyone, but documented by no one. That changed in January 1944, when a technical team from Wright Field in Ohio arrived at several 8th Air Force bases to investigate the cold weather starting problems. The team included civilian engineers from the Wright Aeronautical Corporation, military technical specialists, and officers from the Air Technical Service Command. Their mission was to document the problem and develop an official solution. Among the team members was a man named Weldon Worth. He was not a military officer, but a civilian engineer working for the Army Air Corps. Worth had spent years studying lubrication systems, and he had actually been working on the cold weather starting problem since before the war. He had conducted tests at Wright Field using climate chambers that could simulate Arctic conditions, and he had developed theories about oil dilution that paralleled what the ground crews in England had discovered independently. When Worth arrived at the 8th Air Force bases and began talking to the ground crews, he was astonished to discover that they were already implementing a solution that closely matched his own research. The mechanics, working under desperate conditions with no official guidance, had reasoned their way to the same conclusion that his careful laboratory work had reached. Worth documented everything. He interviewed dozens of ground crew chiefs, collected samples of the diluted oil mixtures, analyzed the wear patterns on engines that had been started using the method, and compared them to engines started conventionally. What he found was that the field expedient solution was not only effective, but remarkably safe when done correctly. The key, Worth determined, was controlling the ratio of gasoline to oil, and ensuring that the mixture was done shortly before starting attempts. If the gasoline was added and then allowed to sit for too long, it could separate out. If too much gasoline was used, there was indeed a risk of inadequate lubrication during the first moments of operation. But within a fairly broad range of mixtures, roughly 1 part gasoline to 3 to 5 parts oil, The system worked reliably and safely. Worth's report back to Wright Field was comprehensive and forceful. He recommended that oil dilution be adopted as an official cold weather starting procedure for all radial aircraft engines operating in cold climates. He provided detailed specifications for mixing ratios, procedures for implementation, and guidelines for when the technique should be used. He credited the innovation to field maintenance personnel operating under challenging conditions, though he did not name Sergeant Dalton or any other individual mechanic. The bureaucratic wheels turned slowly, but they turned. By March 1944, official technical orders were issued authorizing oil dilution for cold weather starting. The procedure was standardized, specific mixing ratios were mandated, safety protocols were established. What had been a desperate field expedient, dismissed by many as a stupid improvisation, became official United States Army Air Forces doctrine. But the adoption of official policy came too late to help with the immediate crisis of the winter of 1943-44. Throughout those brutal months, it was the unofficial, unauthorized, technically questionable practice of oil dilution that kept the bombers flying. Night after night, as temperatures plummeted and ice formed on everything it touched, ground crews across East Anglia mixed gasoline into their engine oil and coaxed frozen engines back to life. The impact on operations was profound. Before the widespread adoption of oil dilution, abort rates due to mechanical problems on cold weather missions could exceed 30%. After the technique became common, abort rates dropped to less than 10%, and most of those aborts were due to problems other than starting difficulties. The number of aircraft available for each mission increased dramatically, allowing the 8th Air Force to maintain the pressure on German industry even through the worst winter weather. The strategic implications were significant. The winter of 1943-44 was a critical period in the air war over Europe. It was during these months that the 8th Air Force finally achieved the numerical strength necessary to conduct the kind of sustained strategic bombing campaign that its commanders had envisioned. But that strength meant nothing if the aircraft could not get off the ground. The oil dilution technique meant that missions like the attacks on Berlin in March 1944 could go forward with maximum force. It meant that the crucial strikes against German aircraft production during Big Week in late February could be conducted with hundreds of bombers rather than dozens. It meant that when the spring of 1944 arrived and the focus shifted to supporting the invasion of France, the 8th Air Force had maintained its operational capability throughout the winter rather than effectively hibernating during the coldest months. There were other innovations during that winter, other examples of ground crew ingenuity. Mechanics developed improvised windscreens to protect engine heaters from the wind. They created systems for preheating fuel lines to prevent fuel gelling. They modified equipment shelters to allow crews to work in slightly less brutal conditions. But none of these innovations had the impact of oil dilution. For Sergeant Michael Dalton, the recognition came slowly and never in the dramatic way that stories sometimes suggest. He was not called to headquarters to receive a medal from a general. There were no newspaper articles, no radio broadcasts. He continued to work on the flight line, continued to maintain his assigned aircraft, continued to do the unglamorous, essential work that kept the bombers flying. His crew chief, Master Sergeant Hammond, did recommend him for a commendation, and eventually Dalton received a Bronze Star for meritorious service. The citation was vague, mentioning innovative maintenance procedures that significantly enhanced operational readiness, but it did not specify what those procedures were. That was typical of the way the war worked. The big picture was made up of thousands of small actions, most of them unrecorded, many of them never officially acknowledged. The winter eventually broke. By late March, temperatures began to rise, and the desperate cold that had gripped England began to ease. Fog still rolled in, Ice still formed on occasion, but the extreme cold that had made engine starting nearly impossible became less frequent. As spring arrived and temperatures climbed into the 40s and 50s Fahrenheit, the need for oil dilution diminished. Engines started normally again, and the technique that had been so crucial during the winter was used less and less. But the lessons learned were not forgotten. The official technical orders remained in place. Oil dilution became a standard procedure taught to aircraft mechanics throughout the military. It was used not just in Europe, but in other cold-weather operations. Aircraft operating in Alaska, in the Aleutian Islands, in China during winter months, all benefited from the technique that had been desperately improvised on a frozen English airfield in December 1943. The broader principle was even more important. The oil dilution story became part of the military's institutional knowledge about the value of field innovation. It demonstrated that solutions to complex technical problems could come from the bottom up, from the people directly confronting the problems, rather than only from the top down through official research and development channels. Not everyone saw it that way, of course. There were officers and officials who remained uncomfortable with the idea of unauthorized modifications to critical systems. There were debates about whether the oil dilution technique represented dangerous improvisation or valuable initiative. Some argued that if the problem had been properly anticipated and addressed through official channels, the field expedient would never have been necessary. But the pilots and crew members who flew the missions knew better. They knew that on dozens of mornings during that bitter winter, the only reason they were able to take off was because ground crews had violated the rules to get their engines started. They knew that missions that might have been canceled, targets that might have remained unbombed, strategic objectives that might have been delayed, had all been achieved because some mechanics had been willing to try something stupid. Lieutenant James Morrison, a B-17 pilot with the 100th Bombardment Group, wrote in his diary on a night in early February 1944, "Couldn't believe the ship started this morning. Temperature was below zero, and I thought for sure we'd be scrubbed. But our ground crew had that engine purring in 10 minutes. I don't know what magic they worked, and I probably don't want to know, but those guys are the real heroes of this war. We get the glory, but they get us home." That sentiment was echoed thousands of times during the war. The ground crews, the mechanics, the men who worked in the cold and dark to keep the aircraft flying were the unsung foundation of the entire strategic bombing campaign. They received little recognition, few medals, rarely appeared in the newsreels or newspaper stories. But without them, the campaign simply could not have continued. The oil dilution story is particularly poignant because it represents such a perfect intersection of desperation, ingenuity, and calculated risk. The ground crews were desperate because they were failing at their fundamental mission of keeping the aircraft operational. They were ingenious because they reasoned their way to a solution using basic principles and practical experience. And they took calculated risks because they understood that the potential benefits outweighed the potential dangers. It is worth noting that the technique was not without its critics even after it was officially adopted. Some engine manufacturers remained concerned about potential long-term effects on engine longevity. Some pilots worried about the safety implications of introducing gasoline into the oil system. There were occasional incidents where improper application of the technique caused problems, reinforcing the concerns of those who had opposed it. But the data spoke for itself. Engine failure rates did not increase during the period when oil dilution was widely used. In fact, some studies suggested that the technique, by enabling engines to start more smoothly in cold weather, actually reduced wear compared to the violent grinding starting attempts that were common when trying to crank over engines filled with semi-solidified oil. Moreover, the technique proved adaptable. As the war progressed and operations extended into other theaters and conditions, oil dilution was modified and refined. Different mixing ratios were developed for different engine types. Procedures were adapted for use with different grades of oil and fuel. The basic principle remained the same, but the specific applications evolved to meet different needs. After the war, oil dilution remained a part of military aviation doctrine for decades. It was used during the Korean War, during operations in Northern Europe during the Cold War, and in various other contexts where aircraft needed to operate in extreme cold. Commercial aviation also adopted variations of the technique for use in bush flying, air ambulance operations in cold climates, and other specialized applications. By the 1960s, however, the technique was gradually becoming less necessary. Advances in lubricant chemistry produced multigrade oils that maintained better viscosity characteristics across a wide temperature range. Improved engine designs featured better cold weather starting capabilities. More sophisticated preheating systems made it possible to reliably warm engines without resorting to oil dilution. The technique that had been so crucial during World War II slowly faded from common use, but it was never completely abandoned. Even today, some aircraft operating in extreme cold weather conditions still use variations of oil dilution for cold starts. The principle remains sound. If the oil is too thick to flow, thin it temporarily with a volatile solvent that will evaporate as the engine warms up. The specific implementations may have changed, but the fundamental insight that Sergeant Dalton and his fellow mechanics discovered on that frozen December night in 1943 remains valid. The story of oil dilution also highlights something else: the often invisible contribution of maintenance personnel to military operations. History tends to focus on the dramatic moments, the combat actions, the battles won and lost. The names we remember from the air war over Europe are pilots like Jimmy Doolittle, fighter aces like Francis Gabreski, commanders like Curtis LeMay. We remember the aircraft, the missions, the targets, but for every pilot who flew into combat, there were 10 or more ground personnel who made that flight possible. Mechanics, armorers, fuel handlers, radio technicians, clerks, cooks, medics, and countless others formed the infrastructure that supported combat operations. Their work was often tedious, frequently uncomfortable, occasionally dangerous, and rarely glamorous, yet without them, the entire enterprise would have collapsed. The ground crews of the 8th Air Force during World War II were a remarkable group. Many were young men with only minimal training, thrust into situations that required them to maintain and repair some of the most complex machines of their era under conditions that would be considered unacceptable in any peacetime environment. They worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, often outdoors in brutal weather. They worked with inadequate tools, insufficient parts, and under constant pressure to get aircraft ready for the next mission. And yet, they succeeded. Month after month, year after year, they kept the bombers flying. They repaired battle damage that seemed irreparable. They improvised solutions to problems that had no answers in the technical manuals. They made do with what they had and made it work. The oil dilution story is just one example, but it is representative of thousands of similar innovations, adaptations, and improvisations that collectively made victory possible. Looking back from the distance of more than 80 years, it is easy to view the oil dilution technique as an obvious solution. The chemistry is straightforward. The principle is simple. Why was it not implemented from the beginning? Why did it take desperate field mechanics to figure it out? The answer lies in the complexity of military operations and the challenges of preparation. The planners who organized the strategic bombing campaign had to consider thousands of variables. They had to arrange for bases, fuel, ammunition, replacement aircraft, crews, support personnel, and countless other elements. They developed procedures for operations in various weather conditions, for dealing with combat damage, for handling emergencies. But they were planning from offices and conference rooms, often far from the actual conditions of operations. They relied on manuals and specifications developed by manufacturers, on testing done under controlled conditions, on theories about how things should work. They did not fully anticipate what it would mean to operate a massive fleet of heavy bombers through a European winter with temperatures far below anything the aircraft had been tested in, under conditions that pushed every system to its limits. The field mechanics, by contrast, were living with the problem every day. They saw directly what worked and what did not. They experienced firsthand the consequences of each failure, and they had both the practical knowledge and the desperate motivation to try unconventional solutions. It was that combination of knowledge, experience, and necessity that led to innovation. This pattern repeated itself throughout the war and continues in military operations to this day. Official procedures and policies provide a framework, but they cannot anticipate every situation. Field personnel, those closest to the actual problems, often develop the best solutions. The challenge for military organizations is to remain flexible enough to recognize and adopt good ideas regardless of their source, while maintaining enough discipline to prevent dangerous improvisation. The oil dilution story represents a successful balance. The field innovation was eventually recognized, studied, refined, and officially adopted. It did not remain an underground technique whispered about, but never acknowledged. The military system was flexible enough to learn from its own people and incorporate their solutions into official doctrine. That process was not always perfect. There were delays, bureaucratic obstacles, resistance from those invested in official procedures. But ultimately, the innovation was embraced, and it made a real difference to the war effort. That is a model worth remembering and emulating. As the war drew to a close and the 8th Air Force prepared to redeploy, many of the ground crews who had worked through that terrible winter returned home. They went back to civilian life, to jobs and families, to towns and cities across America. Most never spoke much about their service. When they did, they talked about the aircraft they maintained, the crews they supported, the missions they helped make possible. They rarely mentioned specific innovations like oil dilution, because to them it was just part of the job. Sergeant Michael Dalton returned to his hometown in Ohio after the war. He went back to work as a mechanic, eventually opening his own small garage. He worked on cars and trucks, helped farmers keep their equipment running, lived a quiet life. He told his children stories about the war, about England, about the B-17s he had maintained, but he never spoke much about the night in December 1943 when he had mixed gasoline into engine oil and started engines that everyone else had given up on. It was not until many years later, when aviation historians began documenting the history of the 8th Air Force, that the story of oil dilution came to wider attention. Researchers discovered the official reports from Wright Field, read the after-action summaries from the winter of 1943-44, and pieced together how a simple field expedient had solved a critical problem. They tracked down surviving veterans, including Dalton, and recorded their stories. Dalton, by then an elderly man, was bemused by the attention. It wasn't anything special, he told one historian. We had a problem, we figured out a solution, and we made it work. That's what you do. That's all we ever did. But it was special. It was special because it demonstrated the power of practical ingenuity in the face of complex problems. It was special because it showed how desperate circumstances can drive innovation. It was special because it represented the contributions of thousands of anonymous mechanics who kept the war machine running through skill, determination, and the willingness to take calculated risks. The bombers of the 8th Air Force flew more than 300,000 sorties during World War II. They dropped approximately 700,000 tons of bombs. They played a crucial role in the destruction of Nazi Germany's war-making capacity, in the preparation for D-Day, in the final defeat of the Third Reich. The crews who flew those missions, the pilots and bombardiers and gunners, deserve all the recognition they receive. They faced death every time they climbed into their aircraft, and tens of thousands of them never came home. But behind every one of those missions, supporting every one of those crews, were the ground personnel who made flight possible. They were the mechanics who changed engines in freezing rain. They were the armorers who loaded tons of bombs while aircraft were still being repaired around them. They were the fuel handlers who filled thousands of gallons of high-octane gasoline into aircraft while praying there would be no spark. They were the radio technicians, the electricians, the riggers, the countless specialists whose work was essential but often invisible. And on cold winter mornings when official procedures failed and desperate measures were needed, they were the men who mixed gasoline into engine oil, who tried something that seemed stupid but might just work, who took responsibility for unauthorized actions because they understood that the mission was more important than the rules. The winter of 1943-44 passed into history. The bombers continued to fly, missions continued to be flown. The strategic bombing campaign continued to evolve and intensify. By the time spring arrived and temperatures rose, oil dilution had become routine, one more procedure in the long list of tasks that ground crews performed to keep the aircraft operational. But for a few critical months, that stupid repair, that unauthorized field modification, that desperate improvisation made the difference between mission success and mission failure. It kept the bombers flying through the coldest winter. It maintained operational pressure on Nazi Germany when a pause might have given the enemy time to recover and regroup. It demonstrated that victory in war depends not just on grand strategy and high-level decisions, but on the practical ingenuity of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. The legacy of that winter, of that simple technique of mixing gasoline into oil, extended far beyond World War II. It became part of aviation lore, a story told to generations of aircraft mechanics about the importance of practical knowledge and creative problem-solving. It was studied in military schools as an example of successful bottom-up innovation. It influenced how the military approached maintenance doctrine and field modifications in subsequent conflicts. Most importantly, it stood as a reminder that war is not just about weapons and tactics, not just about generals and politicians. War is also about mechanics in the dark, working with cold hands on frozen engines, trying to find a way to make things work when they should not work, when every official source says they cannot work, when the only options are to give up or to try something that seems stupid. They tried. It worked. And because it worked, the bombers flew, and history took a different course than it might have if those engines had remained frozen and silent on their hard stands. In the end, that is what makes the story of oil dilution significant, not because it was technically complex or dramatically heroic, but because it was simple, practical, and effective. It was ordinary people solving an urgent problem with the tools and knowledge they had available. It was the kind of innovation that does not make headlines, but that makes victory possible. On every airfield in East Anglia during that terrible winter, on every hard stand where B-17s and B-24s waited for their crews, there were mechanics who knew how to make those engines start. They knew because they had figured it out, because they had tried when others had given up, because they had been willing to do something that seemed stupid in order to accomplish something that was essential. Those mechanics are mostly gone now. The airfields they worked on have largely disappeared, returned to farmland, or developed into industrial sites. The B-17s they maintained exist now only as museum pieces, and the few airworthy examples maintained by aviation preservationists. The world they worked in of total war and existential struggle has passed into history. But the lesson remains. When complex systems fail, when official procedures prove inadequate, when circumstances demand solutions that do not exist in the manuals, innovation comes from the people closest to the problem. It comes from those who understand both the principles involved and the practical realities. It comes from those willing to take calculated risks, to try unconventional approaches, to do what is necessary, rather than what is approved. That was the real legacy of oil dilution, not the technical procedure itself, which was eventually superseded by better oils and better engine designs, but the principle it represented. The principle that sometimes the best solutions come from the bottom up, from field personnel who see problems that planners never anticipated. The principle that innovation in military operations requires flexibility, willingness to learn from experience, and the courage to adopt solutions that come from unexpected sources. On a frozen airfield in England in December 1943, a young sergeant from Ohio mixed gasoline into engine oil because he was desperate, because he had reasoned through the problem, and because he was willing to try something that everyone else dismissed as stupid. That decision, repeated by hundreds of other mechanics across dozens of other airfields, kept the strategic bombing campaign alive during its most critical winter. It was, in its own quiet way, a turning point in the air war over Europe. And it all started with what seemed like a stupid idea, tried by desperate men who had no other choice, and who discovered that sometimes, when everything else has failed, stupid ideas are the only ones that work.